right, psychology nerds, and welcome to a new episode of Psychology and Stuff, the podcast from Good Cause Productions at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. I'm your host, Alison Jane Martingano, and today we're going to be exploring the psychology of flourishing. I'm lucky to be joined today by two experts on flourishing and the hosts of Flourishing FM, Dr. Nick Holton and Dr. Jon Beale. Our first guest is Dr. Nick Holton, whose work centers on helping individuals and teams and organizations identify and actualize their potential through the science of human flourishing. He's the co-founder of the Anti-Fragile Academy, which supports resilience and performance in high-pressure environments. Nick also works as a private coach, consultant, and collaborates with professional athletes, Fortune 100 executives, schools, and entrepreneurs around the world. Joining him is Dr. Jon Beale, a researcher, coach, and writer whose work focuses on how we can most effectively promote flourishing in education and the workplace. Jon is a research affiliate of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University and has previously held posts at Oxford University and Eton College. He also coaches performance and well-being for the Flow Research Collaborative and the Center for Human Potential. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about flourishing today. And I guess I really should start with just a very general question. What is flourishing? And I'll leave it up to you who's going to answer that.
Do you want our answer, the research-backed answer, or some mixture of the two?
Oh, so now I'm curious. Well, yeah, tell me all and how they're different.
Well, obviously, our answer is a research-backed answer. I kind of meant fit different theories. So you get a mixture of different definitions across different theories of flourishing, going right back from Aristotle to today. Some of the most kind of dominant ones today are, for example, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard defines flourishing as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which a person lives. And there are distinctions drawn between well-being and flourishing. Some have high well-being if they live in a context where flourishing is difficult, like a conflict zone, for example, but they can't flourish in that area. But you can flourish as long as all key aspects of a person's life are good and your context is good. That's one popular definition. Another is positive psychology, which defines flourishing in terms of primarily psychological well-being and then looks at key domains of that. If you look at the major theories of flourishing, you can extract 8 key areas of life, arguably 9, based on a recent discussion Nick and I had. Shige Oishi about psychological richness. That's certainly made me think more recently about this being a 9th area, but the kind of key 8 areas of life that constitute flourishing uncontroversially, if you look at all the key theories, are fulfillment of potential, but also fulfillment in the sense of life satisfaction, close social relationships, positive emotions, and happiness as well, meaning, purpose in a sense that you matter, like your work matters. You're not just insignificant at your role at work. Character and virtue, so character strengths or character virtues, flow states, and health, mental and physical health, and also accomplishment, like you feel like you're accomplishing things in your day-to-day life. You find those key areas across contemporary theories of flourishing. So if you wanted like an uncontroversial theory of flourishing, it would be about what it means to flourish is to build all of those areas of life as much as you reasonably can, without your efforts to build any one of those resulting in risking significantly depleting any of the others. So for example, you can really strive towards meaningful accomplishments and work very hard, as long as that doesn't come at a significant risk to your health or your relationships. And we see all the time people put so much effort into their work that their relationships, their health suffers, right? So there you say that someone's one area of personal life going well, but other areas that are key to flourishing are suffering.
So there is not just flourishing, you have to tick every box.
Yeah. Sorry?
You have to tick every box to be flourishing. You can't
You don't have to tick every box, and there is no kind of flat score you have to achieve. There's flourishing measures, but no theory says you have to achieve 80% to flourish. But it does seem to be a kind of a common view that you should try and promote each of these areas as much as possible without there being a risk from your efforts to promote any one or more of them, risking significantly depleting any of the others. So you've got to have a kind of a rough balance, but that balance will vary based on a person's character. Some people really value meaningful work. Other people value their relationships more than that. There's nothing wrong with that, but you just want a balance where one or more areas doesn't suffer as a result of your efforts to promote any of the other ones.
Fair enough. And you said that was the uncontroversial definition. So what's the controversial definition?
Well, you can imagine there being, I'm not sure if there's a single controversial definition, but you can imagine there being controversial views on what it means to flourish, where it's like to accomplish as much as humanly possible, more than any human being's ever accomplished in their life, which can be quite individualistic unless the accomplishments are things that benefit all people, or to commit your life to trying to make your health as fantastic as possible. I mean, those would be controversial views because they might just benefit an individual rather than a group. And also they're only accessible to certain people, right? Not everyone can devote huge amounts of their time to promoting their health and so on. You can imagine all kinds of controversial views like this, right?
Yeah, I'd actually like to dig into that a little bit more because you mentioned that, if somebody's living in a certain environment that makes it difficult for them to flourish. So is it something that's really comes along with a privilege to be able to flourish, to have the possibility to thrive in all of these areas? Or is it something you can achieve even in a limited context?
Nick, do you want to come in on this or would you go?
I mean, this is always like the psychologist's answer, but I think it's a bit of both and it depends, to a certain extent. Certainly, I think we have a good deal of evidence that says there is some kind of effective of control, right? Locus of control around different forms of well-being and our habits and our behaviors. And so to a certain extent, I think we always want to empower people to suggest you can take more of your flourishing by the scruff of the neck, so to speak. I'm always really reticent to suggest you can just sort of flourish. John and I used to work for an individual that would talk about flow being like task agnostic. You can just sort of get it in any situation. I disagreed with that, and I feel similarly about flourishing. I don't think it's context agnostic, as John's pointing out, right? So how do we help people understand it in a way that empowers them to do what they can, right? To feel good, to perform well, to grow, to find alignment with sort of their form of, let's call it well-being or happiness or whatever language you want to use. And then I think there's the other big piece here, which we can get into a little bit more. Maybe it's too tangential, but I think the more and more John and I have conversations, we realize it's somewhat affect independent. Someone could be flourishing with elements of unpleasantness in their life. And in fact, those may be contributing to meaning, or John mentioned Shige Oishi, psychological richness in some way. So, John's right. In some ways it's controversial. In some ways there's some clear kind of like takeaways and segmentations and components. But I think one thing we're discovering more and more that's probably new for people to hear is that affect independence, right?
Yeah. So you can be unhappy or having a difficult time and still be flourishing.
Depends on their theory, right? Yeah, Corey Keyes, you can have mental illness and be flourishing. Right? I mean, you know how the science works. There's a lot of different theories and debates here. I think that's kind of what John's nodding to in his original answer as well.
All right. Well, then let me ask you personally, Nick and John, do you think that you can be unhappy and flourishing?
For certain periods of your life, yes. I mean, flourishing is a long-term way of being. Should have added that, right? And this is not a new idea. And this is one of the controversial aspects of Aristotle's theory of flourishing, actually. He argued that you can only say a person flourished when they reach the end of their life. So when you look at their life as a whole,
Right.
that's quite controversial. Okay, got a controversial theory of flourishing. That aspect is controversial. So you can't say of someone when they're elderly yet that they've flourished because they haven't yet reached the end of their life. It's like a conclusion you draw of a person's life as a whole.
See.
I think that's incorrect. You can.
I love it when people disagree with Aristotle. It's strong opinion.
And it seems to be a long-term way of being, right? But that doesn't mean you couldn't say sections of a person's life they flourish in sections they didn't. So you can say someone in their 20s or their 40s or their 50s, they flourished, or that was a period of their life, that person really flourished, but then they had a really terrible period of their life where they really didn't, right? So in terms of whether you can be unhappy and flourishing, yeah, day to day, of course, but there could be whole swathes of a person's life where they have a really difficult period. Maybe they experienced clinical depression for many years, and you might say in that period of their life, they really didn't flourish, but their life as a whole was one in which they flourished.
I like that. No, that helps me understand. So it's really sort of a judgment on your whole life, not single parts. It's more of a an overall state as opposed to, I'm trying to think, like a current state. I'm not phrasing this very well. You might.
No, it's you are, because one of the challenges in any sort of, let's call it, well-being or happiness research is how do you measure and assess these things? And so, for instance, on my dissertation, we use experience sampling method. So, okay, what do we mean by flourishing? What do we mean by happiness? Do we mean in this moment? Do we mean the next day? How many moments need to be added together to count as well-being? Are we going to check again in a month? Are we going to check again in a year? And which scores do we count? Right. So the same applies to flourishing. And of course, almost all of this is happening on self-report measures. So it's largely subjective in many ways. Right. So the question, so how do you know if you're flourishing? What's the right level of flourishing? Those sorts of things. Again, it's a little bit of a cop-out, but some of that is it's in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. There are some consistencies, and I think we can suggest to people that these things are going to make it more likely, more probable that you're going to be flourishing more than not. But there's still going to be seasonality to it. And you still, I think, have to be very self-aware of where that congruence and that sense of alignment is for you in terms of what is flourishing and how do you have to live in order to feel that concordance, right?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So I could feel like I'm not flourishing, and someone else could look at me and say, "You are flourishing." Is there a right
100%.
or who's right in that situation, or it really is you could go either way?
Good question. I mean, some of the domains are purely subjective, like positive emotions, right? So from those 8 domains, that one's going to be subjective experience, right? You have first person authority of your emotions. But some of them could be a blend of subjective and objective. So meaning, purpose, and mattering. Someone could genuinely be leading a meaningful life that on any definition of meaningful looks extremely meaningful and purposeful, and they really matter, but they suffer from, let's say, clinical depression, and the way they view their life is not through the same degree of accuracy about how meaningful the life is as a whole. They just see it with a deeply negative affect such that they don't perceive the strength of meaning and purpose of life. So I think there are some domains where a person could be wrong about how good their life is. Meaningful accomplishments would be another. Someone's accomplishing things, they just don't think that they're meaningful when they really are on any reasonable measure. But there's some that will be subjective, like emotions.
Yeah, and presumably the flip side too. You could have somebody who's is grossly narcissistic and thinks they're amazing and they're flourishing, and by other people's standards, they're not.
Exactly.
I want to touch on something that you briefly mentioned before, Jon, which was that some of the controversial theories of flourishing might be more sort of self-centered, would count as flourishing as opposed to more collective. Could you talk to me a little bit more about how flourishing is personal versus a collective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a criticism that's sometimes made of positive psychology. I don't think always fairly, but it is quite individualistic. But it focuses on an individual person's psychological well-being, and then there's like adaptations of positive psychology that add physical well-being to it as well, but they typically focus on the individual. I don't think that's entirely fair, because one of the key domains of flourishing in positive psychology is relationships, and character strengths are built into it as well. So I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but a criticism that's sometimes made of some theories of flourishing is they focus on the individual, what it means for them to flourish. But we are, inherently highly social beings. Our flourishing really does depend upon both other people and our environment. By environment, I mean cultural and historical setting in which we live, whether that environment is one that's congenial for the very possibility of living a flourishing life. If there are various aspects of your environmental culture that just prevent you from doing things that we regard as, inherent human rights, then that's not going to make it possible for you to reach a certain level of flourishing, right? So theories that lay too much emphasis on the individual would be those that are, that we regard as controversial for that reason.
Right. So that's to take a really extreme example. Hitler, pretty successful in his life, doing what he wanted to do. Had he stayed a second-rate painter for most of his life, then maybe he wouldn't have been personally flourishing. And that's sort of taking that argument to the most extreme, and you would say an incorrect version of flourishing.
Well, key to any reasonable account of flourishing, I would argue uncontroversially, because this goes right back to all theories, going right back to Aristotle, is that you cultivate good character. And Hitler is the antithesis of good character, right?
I'm perfectly can agree on that.
It's not uncontroversial to say that if a person lives a deeply evil life or is a deeply evil person or both, that prevents them from flourishing. That's a pretty reasonable view to hold, right? So I would argue that being evil prevents the possibility of flourishing and also prevents the possibility of other people flourishing too.
Yeah.
I don't think we know yet.
Okay. Go ahead, Nick.
I don't think we know yet. I think, John, the second part for sure, obviously it's going to hinder other people's ability to flourish. I think, and this is a tie-in to me with your question, which has a cultural lens. Should flourishing be a goal to begin with, right? And so I think there's something to be said for investigating further. This topic comes up more than you might imagine. John and I, we've had this like Hitler topic 4 or 5 different episodes with, right? Because it's a common question. It makes good sense, right? I think there's a potential timeline where they are, according to their subjective experience and affect and all these other things and values, flourishing, but they are making it much harder, right, for others to flourish. In fact, they're creating languishing. And then to me, there's the cultural question of, is flourishing good in that case? It certainly doesn't seem very symbiotic, right? And when I think about some of John's notable criticisms about pause psych, I think individualism, it's not even just the individualism, it's individualism to a certain extent where there's often a failure to be symbiotic, right? And relationships and meaning and purpose, these other connected things, are almost viewed as utility to flourishing and to good life. Whereas in a lot of, I'm going to say mostly, I hate the phrase, but non-Western cultures, the symbiosis is the default, right? That is flourishing. In fact, they might even reject the idea of flourishing to a certain extent.
So flourishing is culture dependent. What it means to flourish in one culture might look different from another?
I certainly think we're finding that in the first phase of data from the global flourishing study. Wouldn't you say, John? I think that's been one of the main takeaways we heard from Matt and have seen.
Yeah, they're discovering that across the world, that there's different levels of flourishing worldwide. I mean, they are asking about a certain conception of flourishing, but different perceptions of certain aspects of what it means to flourish and certainly different levels of flourishing worldwide. But I mean, on the morality of flourishing, and Nick and I have different views. It's interesting to learn about our different views on this. I think if flourishing is living a good life, that's, historically what it means. And goodness here can be interpreted in various ways, fulfilling your potential soul, but I take it as a moral component to it too. So that's one of the reasons I don't think you can say an evil person would flourish, because you can't reasonably say they lived a good life where it has that moral aspect to it.
I want to follow up on this global flourishing study that you just mentioned, because I'm a data person by interest, and so I'm curious, when they're measuring flourishing in these surveys. I'm assuming they're translating it into the different languages around the world, but they're also changing the meaning of the questions. Is what counts as flourishing different, or is this putting one definition of flourishing on and asking them whether they meet that? I'm just curious if you could tell me more about how that's measured.
Yeah, so for the global flourishing study, they did do some pretty rigorous research before the study began, where they would ask, it's taking place in 22 geographically and culturally diverse countries, and they would ask various groups within each of those countries about the items from the survey to check that various words and concepts weren't lost in translation, such as flourishing, character, fulfillment, life satisfaction, happiness, and so on. This can be clearly communicated. There is a measure that's used by the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard of there's 6 key domains in this measure, corresponding to, I believe, 12 questions, 2 for each of the domains. But those then have been translated based on the research did beforehand. So they are using a single measure, but they haven't just kind of gone with it from the outset. They've checked it's workable in practice globally first.
Thanks, Jon. I'm going to shift gears now a little bit because I want to talk about how challenge and adversity relates to flourishing. And I think from what I've been reading, there is a connection that a certain amount of adversity maybe helps us to flourish, but I assume too much prevents us from flourishing. So is there like a sweet spot there? And could you talk to the relationship between challenge in our lives and flourishing?
Yeah, I think it depends on the layer, the level you kind of want to go at it, because I think it's very multi-layered. I think we can see it to a certain extent on neurophysiological levels, right? We have a colleague and board member for our company that basically studies how stress actually before performance can enhance performance, right? We can see this on very micro levels. On a psychological level, we have different terms that are reactive, right? Like resilience or post-traumatic growth. And some people will define resilience as including growth, right? So, I think some of the common examples, I always like the phrase chosen suffering. I go to Paul Bloom at Yale and his book, The Sweet Spot. You asked about the sweet spot. It's hard to categorize because ultimately, even if it's not chosen, even if it's initially very harmful, I want to sort of acknowledge and honor the people that are still able to do these amazing things of turning that into something that seemingly has benefit, right? But to me, that's not necessarily even the most interesting question that you're kind of asking. That's sort of the obvious piece. The interesting question is, when it comes to flourishing, are we just going along, trying to build flourishing, hoping we're flourishing, waiting until something goes wrong, fixing it, and then just going back and hoping for the best? What about the role of taking on hard things, meaningful things, things that are unpleasant, but are still embraced in a different way, right? To me, that's one of the more interesting questions still remaining around flourishing and the role that plays. So, with you get married, like that's largely a pleasant thing, I hope for most people. It certainly is for me. But you're also acknowledging you're going to be doing some hard stuff along the way, right? And it's often post-argument, right, where emotions get high or where vulnerability shows up, that the relationship deepens and you can go beyond marriage, right? And you can find countless examples in performance, the way stress can enhance performance, the way it can increase motivation. That's the reason we stop procrastinating a lot of the time and focus. We can find example after example after example. What does that ultimately do for these sort of larger measures of flourishing, I think, is yet to be determined. But, we have some hunches. I think we have some educated guesses.
I'd love to hear him.
Well, I think you just did to a certain extent. I mean, I would argue, and this is why Jon and I really, really loved our most recent episode. We haven't released it yet, but with Shigeo Ishii, because I think these three types of well-being, if you will, happiness, which is sort of hedonistic, right, and positive affect or pleasant affect, meaning, which is really, as Jon was talking about earlier, other-oriented in some way, shape, or form. It's impact-oriented. And then you have richness. And Jon, I want you to correct me if you think you took this differently, but I kind of simply put, richness was about perspective shifting.
Yeah, and that's right.
Right? And so to me, perspective shifting in a lot of ways is also an unpleasant experience.
Okay, that's interesting.
Can you tell me exactly what perspective shifting is in this case?
You want to jump in here, Jon? I've kind of been rambling, but yeah, tell him.
So, Shigehiro Ishii published this fascinating book recently called Life in Three Dimensions, which is building upon a lot of research he's done on the concept of psychological richness, which is experiences that change our perspectives on something in a significant way. So there's various ways you could do this. It could be through art or the arts more generally. It could be through travel. It could be through conversation. It could be through writing. There's all kinds of ways to do this, but it has to be a substantial change in perspective. Maybe have through a debate and so on. And he argues that these are experiences that people pursue often as ends in themselves, not for any further reason. And whilst they promote happiness and meaning, key components of flourishing, they also are sometimes pursued independently of those, and so can contribute to a good life. And so when I said earlier that, that if you look at the key theories of flourishing, we can extract those 8 key areas I mentioned earlier. He convinced me about the 9th here.
This is the 9th.
Yeah, which means I'm going to have to change. So I recently used the acronym Flourish to capture those 8 areas. So 8 letters in it. So that's now gone down the toilet. I'm going to have to find 9 letters.
Yeah, you're not using the acronym. Darn.
But so it is a fascinating conversation. Highly recommend Shige's work. What I hadn't thought of, though, until Nick just mentioned it then. So maybe I've had a shift in perspective for a psychologically rich experience, thanks to what Nick just said, is that those could be negative experiences. For example, you could have a shift in perspective that makes you believe that things you thought for years are just wrong. And those things are deeply meaningful to you. It might be a theory you endorse or a political view you hold, and you're like, I'm wrong about that. And maybe that means years of work you've done. Now, the conclusions are wrong, or maybe you've God, and I built my life around this view that's wrong. You can imagine someone thinking that way. So that's the way it could be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in social psychology, we talk about how, when we have these ingrained beliefs, these worldviews, and how we try and defend them, usually we're resistant to this change in perspective that you're talking about. And so I'm thinking about sort of trait level differences on the amount that people are psychologically flexible, with some people being more likely to adopt these perspectives and change their minds, and other people being more rigid and likely to stay in them. But I do acknowledge that the process of changing your perspective can be a deeply difficult and challenging thing to do.
Can be, yeah. It doesn't have to be, right? But certainly can be, yeah. And we have so much to kind of still know and wrestle with around flourishing, but this most recent conversation, and Jon laid out these 8 or 9 different parts that different shops are debating should be included, shouldn't be included, depends on how you define it, all these sorts of things. But these 3 simple ideas of sort of like happiness, meaning, and richness. And your question earlier, does flourishing mean I've got all 3 of those? And I want to go back and just kind of push back against that automatically because of this idea of coherence and alignment, right? And I'm thinking of, and we can probably all name somebody maybe in our lives, they're somewhat pessimistic. They're not super interested in growth, or let's call it really expansive experiences. They feel safe where they are. They like that. That makes them happy. That gives them a source of meaning, and they might not give a damn about richness. I'm not ready to say that person can't be flourishing.
Okay.
I'm not there, right?
Yeah.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the data on sort of personality shifts over the lifetime, and how people are generally more open to new experiences earlier in life, and then as you get older, you become a little bit more ingrained in the normal way of functioning. So do you think that, is there also, I guess I should ask you, is there also evidence that we're more likely to flourish or be more open to richness and new experiences earlier in our lives? I know we talked earlier about you can't flourish until the end of your life, so I might be contradicting myself here.
There would be for certain areas of flourishing. So,
well, all I'm thinking about is what Dr. Oishi shared with us recently, which isn't sort of an exact answer, but I do remember him mentioning sort of associations between preferences for richness and the big 5. And what probably won't surprise you is that there was a really strong association between a preference for richness and openness to experience, and not with the other 4. For meaning and happiness, they had strong associations with the other 4 and not openness, which I think is interesting and probably needs to become a further line of research questions at some point.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. I wouldn't have guessed that last one. Yeah, okay, so there are perhaps personality trends as to which aspects of flourishing you might more gravitate towards more easily.
That was my takeaway.
Yeah, I'm still thinking actually about this idea we spoke about earlier. So we talked about the sweet spot for maybe challenges, and not too challenging but not too easy. But you also, this idea of selecting our own challenges. So it may not just be the intensity of the challenge that we have that may change the likelihood of our flourishing, but whether we chose it Or not? Am I getting that right?
So we think so, and all I would do is maybe potentially slightly amend chose. And it's funny we're talking about this because I was nerding out with a writing partner of mine and a shared colleague of John and I, Dr. Mary Ann Cotton, on this very question yesterday, because we're writing a series of papers pretty much about it. And the common sort of comparison I give is self-determination theory. Okay, so for, you probably got a big psych audience. Self-determination theory, pretty famous now. You've got these three components: autonomy, competence, relatedness, right? Autonomy, people often think it means choice. I choose to do what I want, when I want, how I want. There's papers that walk through all the different ways to define autonomy, and some of the conceptualizations are not around choice. They are around what's called internalization. There is alignment with said choice or action or experience. So for people listening, the simple example is you're forced to play the sport or go to dance or, learn the violin as a kid. You go stomping and screaming and whatever. But over the course of time, you learn to love it. You've internalized that. It wasn't your choice, but it has become more autonomous, right? So then you extend that question, this idea of a sweet spot. If you're choosing something ahead of time that you know is going to be unpleasant, but there's inherent optimism behind it, efficacy behind it, a challenge mindset behind it, to me, it only makes sense that that's going to create different neurophysiological states than if my initial reaction is, this is bad, I don't want this, I need to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, goodness, I'm thinking, so I've been going through my life so far, trying to minimize the amount of bad situations that I get into, or maybe the challenging situations I get into. And so what you're saying is that if you can find challenging situations that maybe you're optimistic about, or that there's joy, might be the wrong word, but you're fulfilled from them in some way, that maybe we shouldn't be avoiding those.
Yes. I'm surprised, by the way, Alison Jane, you said that. You did a PhD and you've pursued a career as an academic, which are extremely hard things to do. So you've really avoided challenges your whole life?
Well, I suppose if you put it like that, maybe it's that difference between self-perception and how other people see it. But I feel like I've fallen in accidentally to most of the experiences in my life. Because I think of people who make what I consider the hardest, most challenging decision, which is to become a parent. And I've never made that choice myself. But I'm not sure all of them necessarily knew quite how hard it was before they made that decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
And so this is where, and I'm not trying to, pit this idea we're talking about against resilience. I think they're complementary terms. There are times where you're looking to react, mitigate, recover. And I think there's other times where you're saying, I'm actively choosing this because I know it's going to be hard, and that's actually going to make it more interesting and meaningful.
Mm.
yeah.
Mm.
And without wanting to embarrass you, Alison Jane, as well, let's also not forget, you've given a TED talk, published many articles and so on, emigrated
Countries. Yeah, right.
I do admit that the TEDx talk was by far the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
Very, very much at the top of the list.
Yeah, so to connect all this up further, I agree with everything Nick said on the role of challenging experiences in flourishing here. I mean, something to add on this is that these challenging experiences in whatever kind we have in life, be it physical, cognitive, or emotional, some combination of those three, are often the times in which we experience the greatest growth. And, flourishing is something that, again, I would mention, it's a long-term way of being. It's also one that has to develop over your life. If you just kind of don't continue to grow and develop in a variety of ways, not just for physical growth here, we're talking cognitive growth, emotional development, character development, so on, throughout your life in various ways, then whilst you might not be flourishing age 30, that might not continue if you don't continue to build yourself in these ways. And I do hold the view that when we find something difficult, in most cases, that gives us greater reason to do it than not to do it.
Mm.
Be it cognitive, physical, emotion, or two or three of those. Not all cases, but most. If we find something difficult and we're like, shouldn't do that, usually that difficulty is a sign, give us great reason to do that thing, because we and others, ancestral others, will usually benefit from trying to do those things.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to have to let that sit with me. But I think I'm going to ask you both to translate it a little bit because we're coming to the end of our time here. And I'd like to ask you to give some practical advice to the majority of our listeners, which are our students here at UWGB. So to give you a little bit of context, our university is a regional comprehensive state university. We have lots of different students from different walks of life taking part here. Many of them are raising children at home, working full-time jobs, and attempting to get a degree at the same time, which is, I think, definitely a challenging thing to choose to do. So if you were to give some practical advice to our students on how best to flourish, what would you say?
I'll say it two-pronged. As Nassim Taleb would say, a barbell approach, right? To eliminate useless stress and cognitive load in decisions around what you wear, what you eat, whether you work out, when you work, like just get rid of the stuff that's taking energy and time and focus, especially if your time's scarce, that just doesn't really have much meaning or affect around it for you, whatever that is, right? No judgment around it. But the other piece is sort of like building the good. Don't hope you end up happy or flourishing and think it's just going to randomly occur on accident, right? What is your recipe? Jon mentioned, depending on your different conceptualization, right? Like 8 or 9 kind of different components. That's a great place to start. And where's the juice worth the squeeze for you? And that's going to be very context dependent. That's going to be seasonal, right? I work with a couple of professional athletes, female professional athletes, soccer players. We go through stuff about the recipes. We look at the relationship piece, right? Family, friends, partner, community. Partner is not a big deal to them right now. They're focused on their career. They're focused on their game. That's cool. But you should know that. And then hopefully direct your attention and energy. So start with what you're actually trying to build and create in the life you're starting to live. Ruthlessly start to eliminate all the riffraff that doesn't really contribute to that, right? Work from both ends.
I'm gonna have to ask a follow-up question.
Okay.
I'd love to eliminate some riffraff from my life. How do I do that?
Gotcha. How do you do that? Yeah,
how
that's
do you do
that's the trickier question, but Jon will appreciate, like, there's some simple language that I think we both use, coaching, consulting, stuff like that, which is just eliminate, automate, delegate.
Yeah.
And what I think people often miss is that doesn't just mean tasks, that means choices and decisions as well. Just automate them to rule books, right? And consistencies. The most common example people use is meal prep, right? The time it saves, the decision, the pre-commitment. Sometimes we follow habits because of that. And so it's not just trying to get rid of stuff you actually have to do. It's stuff you actually spend time thinking about, right? Stop spending 20 minutes choosing the movie on Netflix. Pick a letter of the alphabet, throw it on random, and let's get on with the night, sort of deal, right?
I love that advice because my husband spends ages flicking through Netflix.
There you go, right? No, maybe it's very meaningful to him. I don't want to rob your husband of the movie scanning, but yeah.
Jon, do you have any advice for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's go to the example. Yeah, you've given a particular context of a student right now. So, I'd stand by the advice I gave earlier about how to flourish, which is promote each of the 8 or maybe 9 areas I've mentioned in your life and the lives of others as much as you easily can, without your efforts to promote any one or more of them, risking significantly depleting any of the others. Add addition I'd make to that, though, is if you've got a period in your life where you know things are going to be different for a while. So a college degree is a great example, right? 3 to 4 years where things are going to be really intense. And the context you've given there of your students balancing that with family commitments is one that's going to be, extremely intense, right? So during that, given that you know that it's a finite period, that for the next 4 years, this is the way life is. I mean, you can plan accordingly, but in that kind of period, you can say, well, in this period of my life, focusing on accomplishment in connection with my degree and caring for my family, these are the most important things, hands down, and pretty much everything else has to take a backseat on that. So those hobbies I love doing, I'm going to put them on hold for a while and maybe not do them as much for the next 4 years. For example, I play a lot of pickleball, like sometimes like 12 hours a week. If I was in that situation, I'd be like, well, okay, one evening a week maybe, or one morning a week at weekend I'll play. And if I can't sometimes, then I'm just have to suck that up and accept it, right? So it might be that certain things that promote flourishing in your life, so that would promote physical health in various ways, is exercise, it can promote flow for me, and it does contribute to fulfillment. It's just going to have to take a back seat, but not forever, but for a while. And that would be an example of where there's a certain period of your life where you prioritize certain things over others, and that's fine. Nick gave the example of someone not prioritizing a romantic relationship in a certain period of life. Again, that's, fine if someone's focused on something else. That doesn't mean they can't flourish. It just also supports the idea and shows how these key domains can fluctuate at different areas of a person's life in terms of their priorities, which is absolutely fine.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said that, because I think I came into this episode thinking that it was you had to tick all these boxes all of the time. And so what I'm understanding now is that flourishing is a long-term goal over the course of our life, and that we can tick some boxes at some time and tick some others at another time. And the goal is more sort of long-term, not do everything and do everything now.
Yeah.
Earlier, we mentioned the levels you could look at this, and I go back to one of our earliest episodes with Dr. Anna Lemke and looking at some of the neuroscience kind of behind the dopamine system, and this idea that you really need to teeter-totter. You need to seesaw. And if you can say no for a while, you're going to actually enhance the intensity of the yes, right? Just kind of generally speaking. You see me waving my hands. I'm sitting here with a yin yang tattooed on my arm, right? Like I think there's something to be said for, if you did tick all the boxes all the time, that'd be pretty boring. And I'm not sure neurochemically we would actually appreciate it. There's probably an argument to be said for the richness that comes with, even though it's unpleasant, exposure to the unpleasant side of the affect scale.
Yeah, I think that's something that's the hardest to intuitively get your head around, is this idea that sometimes feeling bad is good. It's part of being human, and you're not going to have the richness of life without that.
Inside Out 1. This is why it's such a brilliant movie. I'm saying it's funny and it's great and it's all the things, but sadness is the hero.
Yeah,
in that.
That is an awesome movie. I'm glad we plugged that.
Yeah, me too.
Before we go, actually, I just want to give you an opportunity. Could you tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and how they can access Flourish FM?
flourishfmpodcast.com. Everything they need is there. And you can find out about Nick and I on that website as well. I'm on my website, drjonbeale.com, and socials at Dr. Jon Beale. And Nick, you're at Dr.Nick Holton.
So part of the reason we were able to get into the unpleasantness conversation is the work I do is really focused on anti-fragility at this point as another mechanism or pathway to consistent thriving. So if people are interested in that idea and that sort of research and approach, you can find us at theantifragileacademy.com. No hyphen. You can learn more about us there and get in touch with me there. Super easy.
Wonderful. I'll make sure I link to you in our sharing. So thank you both so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for having us. We enjoyed it.
I'm going to record the outro later, so we're all done, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was fun.
So we're going to be doing the editing and all that. There will be a video format of this as well as an audio format, and probably some Instagram reels and little clips like that. I have all your details so I can tag you in all of those.
Perfect. Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you again. Good to see you. Looking forward to chatting. Yep. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you. Psychology and Stuff is brought to you by Good Cast Productions at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. The executive producer is Ryan Martin, the production manager is Rachel Sankey, and our creative director is Jenny Young. The media engineer for this episode is Rachel Sankey, supported by our technical director Al Kuhn at LiveX. Special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Jon Beale and Dr. Nick Holton. If you haven't already, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. I'm your host, Alison Jane Martingano. Keep being amazing.